Mr. President, I have 9 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They do not have the approval of the Democratic leader. Therefore, they will not be permitted to meet. But I ask unanimous consent that a list of committees requesting authority to meet be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have come to the floor this afternoon to mark the 40th anniversary of the first oil moving through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. In Alaska, we call it TAPS. This is an 800-mile-long engineering marvel that runs from the North Slope of Alaska to Tidewater in Valdez. 40 years is a good long history. I recognize that, and so this afternoon, in the interest of time, I will abbreviate the history. But I do want to start the story of our pipeline in the late 1960s. Believe it or not, this was a pretty bleak moment for oil exploration in Alaska. And despite great promise, many companies had given up on exploration on the North Slope. By some account, at that point in time, there were at least 14 dry holes that had been drilled before ARCO and Humble Oil Company decided that they were going to sink just one last well. And it was actually an ARCO executive who described it more as a decision not to cancel a well that was already scheduled rather than to go ahead. But that well, Prudhoe Bay State Number 1, would prove to be a game changer for Alaska. We had discovered oil. We discovered oil on the North Slope and a lot of it. We quickly learned that Prudhoe Bay would be one of the largest oil fields in global history, by far the largest ever discovered in the United States. Early estimates at that time suggested as much as 9 billion barrels of oil could be recovered from it. We have learned over these intervening 40 years that we so far underestimated that. But it was not just the issue of discovering the oil. Prudhoe Bay is located in a very remote part of the state, as far north as you can go. A pretty inhospitable area, given the climate, far away from population centers in the lower 48. So a lot of challenges needed to be overcome before production could begin. And initially, it was like, okay, well, how do we move significant quantities of oil? How do we transport this oil to market? And it was Dan Yergin in his book, The Prize, who did a really great job of describing the various choices that were out there. He said, icebreaker tankers that would travel through the frozen Arctic seas to the Atlantic were seriously considered. Other suggestions included a monorail or a fleet of trucks in permanent circulation on an 8-lane highway across Alaska. They then calculated that it would require most of the trucks in America to do this. There was also a prominent nuclear physicist who recommended a fleet of nuclear-powered submarine tankers that would travel under the polar ice cap to a deep-water port in Greenland, the port to be created in turn by a nuclear explosion. Boeing and Lockheed explored the idea of jumbo jet oil tankers. Well, Mr. President, obviously, none of those ideas came about, and some probably for very, very, very good reason. But after significant study and debate, a pipeline emerged as the best way to transport Alaska's oil. And while 2 routes were considered, one overland, which would run across Canada, an all-Alaska route was ultimately chosen as the best way to go. But even then, pipeline construction could not begin right away. There were serious debates in the state over issues like taxes and tariffs and pipeline ownership, and it really consumed our state's legislature for years. The land claims of Alaska Natives needed to be settled. This occurred in landmark legislation that passed in 1971. And then it was in 1973 that Congress took up the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act. As part of that debate here on the Senate floor, Alaska's senators offered an amendment to deem the environmental impact statement for the pipeline to be sufficient and to shield it from what could have been decades of litigation by its opponents. This was a critically important aspect to the debate and really to the future of the pipeline, to ensure that this construction would not be delayed by litigation. The vote was as close as votes get here in the United States Senate. It was deadlocked 49-49, and sitting in that chair, Mr. President, the Vice President at the time, Spiro Agnew, cast the deciding vote in Alaska's favor. So every time I see the bust out here of President Agnew, I look at him. Other people reflect on the Vice President Agnew in different ways. I reflect on that deciding vote that allowed us to proceed with our Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The pipeline bill went on to pass the Senate on a strong bipartisan basis. Not long after that, then President Richard Nixon signed it into law. This was tremendous news for Alaska, because we would be allowed to move forward with the construction. And the construction of this pipeline was a monumental undertaking. But that monumental undertaking was also done with really considerable speed. In April of 1974, construction on a 360-mile haul road, we now call it the Dalton Highway, began. It was finished in 154 days. For those of you who have heard my plea on the floor to colleagues who have been in committees when I have talked about the history of my efforts to try to get a 10-mile, one-lane gravel non-commercial use road for the people of King Cove, I think about what we were able to accomplish in 154 days with that haul road that allowed us to then help facilitate the build-out of the pipeline. The pipeline itself was the largest privately funded infrastructure project ever undertaken in America at the time. So this was significant. It was significant for Alaska, of course, but it was significant for the nation as well. Its total cost came to be about $8 billion. In October of 1975, there were about 28,000 people who were working to make this pipeline a reality. And that pipeline was completed in 1977. So again, it was 1974, initial construction of the haul road begins. October, in 1977 then, is when it was completed, just 3 years and 2 months after construction began. I'm told it was actually 10 days ahead of schedule, according to one estimate, which is pretty remarkable. But the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and I can't find a picture that really shows well the line, an extraordinary line, again, 800 miles long, running from the North Slope to an ice-free port of Valdez at Tidewater. It crosses 3 mountain ranges, including Adigan Pass, which has an elevation of more than 4,800 feet. It reaches a grade of 55 degrees at one point in the Chugach Range. So up incredible mountains and down the other side, crosses more than 600 streams and rivers. More than 400 miles of it are elevated above the ground. You have it elevated above ground here, but in certain areas, as you follow the pipeline, either by air or occasionally you can see it from the road. It's probably one of the most photographed pipelines in the country, but you'll see it go underground in many parts of the way. About half of it are buried underground, and this was part of the engineering that allowed for a recognition that you're building in a permafrost area. So how you ensure that you're not having impact to the ground and the area around it. It crosses a major fault line, the Denali Fault. Back in November of 2002, we had a 7.9 Richter scale earthquake, just about 90 miles from Fairbanks on that Denali Fault. The pipe moved 7.5 feet horizontally, moving back and forth this way, and 2.5 feet vertically. Now, this pipeline was designed for an 8.5 earthquake, and it allows for 20 feet of horizontal movement and 5 feet of vertical movement. The engineers not only worked to cross some extraordinary terrain, but recognized that this is in an area where earthquakes do happen. And it's extraordinary to listen to the stories of the engineers who inspected every inch of that line after that earthquake in 2002, and their comments about truly this engineering marvel. There's so many stories about the construction of the pipeline, Alaskans as we lived through those pipeline years, and it's hard to really capture what it was like to be in Alaska during the time of the construction of that line. We saw our population just boom as we saw new workers come into the state. I was living in Fairbanks at the time. I was a high school student and graduated just going into college there. Obviously, that was my town, and in my town now, all of a sudden, you have people from Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma. I can remember seeing guys in cowboy boots in Fairbanks in the winter on the ice, thinking these guys are going to figure out how to change their footwear. But we worked to welcome these people who were there to really help make a difference. But there were pressures on our community. You couldn't find a hotel room, you couldn't find a rental car. It was hard for the grocery stores to keep the shelves stocked in many of the towns. We saw significant investment in our communities in many different ways. There were a lot of wild stories and tales, some which are appropriate to tell years afterwards, some that still keep us smiling, but we don't talk too much about them. But many, many good stories out there. I am proud. I'm proud of this extraordinary infrastructure that we have in Alaska, an extraordinary energy asset. And to be celebrating the fact that for 40 years now, this pipeline has been not only contributing to Alaska, but contributing to the nation is something that as Alaskans we do look to with pride. This pipeline is not just a piece of pipe. It's an economic lifeline for the state of Alaska. Over the course of 40 years, TAPS has become the veritable backbone of our state's economy. It's helped us create jobs to the point where our oil and gas industry either employs or supports fully 1/3 of the Alaskan workforce. So pretty significant in terms of its impact. It's generated tremendous revenues for our state, some $168 billion at last count, which have been used for everything from roads to schools to essential services. It really has helped build the state and continues to allow our state to operate. TAPS has allowed us to create our permanent fund, which we have used to convert the revenues from a non-renewable resource, oil, into something that will make an enduring contribution to the growth and the prosperity of future generations. Our pipeline is also allowed us to keep our tax burdens low, which is critical in a state like Alaska, where the cost of living is extraordinarily high. Alaska has one of the lowest tax burdens of any state, and that's thanks to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. It also allows us to keep other industries, whether it's fishing or tourism, keep their taxes much lower than they would otherwise be. The scale of this is often hard to imagine. Dr. Terrence Cole, who is a history professor at the University of Alaska, put it this way back in 2004 when he said, "Prudhoe Bay oil was worth more than everything that has been dug out, cut down, caught, or killed in Alaska since the beginning of time. The discovery of the Prudhoe Bay oil field in the late 1960s fulfilled even the most optimistic dreams for statehood." From day one, Alaska's pipeline has also strengthened the energy security of our nation. You have to remember, TAPS began operating in the wake of the first Arab oil embargo. It helped tide us over during the 1979 oil crisis. It's insulated us from OPEC and lessened our dependence on nations that do not share our interests. It's provided reliable and affordable energy needed by millions of Americans all up and down the West Coast. It really is hard to imagine Alaska without the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It's hard to imagine the consequences that America would have faced without the 17.5 billion barrels of oil that it is now safely carried to market. Think about that, 17.5 billion barrels of oil over the past 40 years. It's no exaggeration to say that while we built a pipeline, that pipeline helped us build our state. Today, as we mark the 40th anniversary of TAPS, we can also take stock of the challenges that it faces. Many are a direct result of the decisions made or perhaps not made in this very chamber. Because while our pipeline once carried 2.1 million barrels of oil per day, accounting for a full quarter of America's supply, today that amount has been crimped down to just over 500,000 barrels a day. And it's not due to lack of resources, not at all, but instead our lack of access to those resources. Alaska has never lacked for energy, just the permission to produce it, despite the promises that have been made to us at statehood and beyond. According to the Federal Energy Information Administration, we have at least 36.9 billion barrels of oil. That's enough to produce 1 million barrels a day for the next 100 years. We have prolific potential in our National Petroleum Reserve, which was specifically set aside for oil production. We have world-class resources in our offshore areas, in the Beaufort and in the Chukchi and in our Arctic Outer Continental Shelf. And we have what is believed to be North America's largest untapped conventional oil field, which would occupy about 1/10,000th of the non-wilderness 1002 area within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And again, this is an area that is specifically set aside for development, and the federal government recommended it be opened for that purpose back in 1987, a 30-year anniversary there. So, Mr. President, while we have the resources, what we need are partners at the federal level who will work with us to restore throughput to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And I welcome the new administration and its commitment to helping us produce energy for Alaska, energy for the nation. Mr. President, I'd like to end with a quote from the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. This is an opinion piece by Admiral Tom Barrett, who is the president of Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. This is the TAPS operator. And he's written this opinion piece, and he states as follows. He says, though there has been a lot of change on TAPS in 40 years, one unwavering constant remains: the commitment of the people who work on TAPS today to provide safe, reliable operational excellence 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, resilient amid all of Alaska's extreme geography and weather. And I think about the men and women, the engineers, the workers, the contractors, all those who do such an incredible job to deal with the day-to-day, to keep that oil flowing safely. And again, as we recognize 40 years of safely transporting this oil, I want to repeat to my colleagues, TAPS, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, is not just a pipeline. It is an economic lifeline for us. It is a source of security and prosperity for us as a nation. And so I join my delegation colleagues, Senator Sullivan, Congressman Young, and all of the Alaskans who are marking this anniversary today. As TAPS reaches 40 good years, we look back, we appreciate the past, but we also look forward and set our sights on another good 40 years to come. With that, Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor.